before we get into that, let's do a quick review of what the events were in chapter 6. Somebody give them to me. What happened? Doesn't even have to be in order. Just spit it out there. All right. Starts off, the king was restless that night. What did he have done? Right. He had the Chronicles of his reign read to him. I guess he thought they'd be boring enough to put him back to sleep. So, and he hears what? What does he hear? He hears a story of how Mordecai saved his life from the assassination plot, and he finds out what had been done for Mordecai. Nothing. That seems like a pretty big oversight. A man saves the king's life, and he gets no reward for that. So he decides to do something about it. What happens as he decides what he's going to do? Right. So at that moment, Haman is coming in to the court, and the king, instead of asking Haman why he's here, he immediately asks him what? He asks what should be done for the man that the king wishes to reward. He doesn't say who, but then Haman thinks that it's clearly about him. Who else could it be about? I'm the second in command, and why would he be asking me this if it's not for me? So Haman comes up with this great idea about giving the man a parade and bestowing him honors, giving him the royal robes, all that stuff. Come to find out, it's not for him, but for the man he hates the most in the world, and he's going to be the one having to parade him through the streets and shouting his honor. After that's over, Haman runs home. He tells his wife and friends what happened. What do they say? Yeah, you're done for, buddy. You're finished. And then at the end of the chapter, the king's men arrive, and they're taking Haman to this latest feast that Esther's throwing. This is now the second one in the king's honor. Does anything in particular stand out about that chapter? Go ahead.
So his wife and friends, they said, if you have this plan against the Jews, you will not prevail. Like, did they already know the Jews would? Like, they let him make all these plans, but now they're telling him you're not going to prevail against these people. They had to have known that God was taking care of them and in control, but yet they let him do all the stuff in the chapters before that led to this. They never said stop. That's not a good idea.
Yeah, I don't know how much they believed in God Himself doing it, or just that the signs maybe all pointed towards Haman's inevitable failure. I think you see something like that in the quick reversal of fortunes. It kind of makes you think that this guy's plans might not be going to be successful. Anything else? Yeah.
If you really think about it, of course, the Lord had instructed the Jews through the prophets to, when you get there, build homes, live in society, pray for the nation that you're involved with, contribute. So the Jews were probably contributing people to the nation that was there. It's quite astounding that Haman would think that he could, under sleight of hand. I hadn't thought about it till Sunday when someone brought up the fact that the king didn't appear to know that the Jews were the ones that were going to be wiped out by Haman's request.
That's interesting. I kind of wondered that myself. Like, how much did the king actually know who he's wiping out? Do you think that he knew it was the Jews, or what do y'all think? You're going to kill all these people? Just. So he didn't put any more thought into it other than the money. Done?
Well, it's possible that he knew Mordecai and was thankful to Mordecai even before reading the Chronicles, and that Haman had to not disclose that on purpose. I guess part of his narrative was
Possible too, yeah. Maybe the king didn't really know that Haman intended to wipe out the Jews themselves. I do think it's interesting. That was one of the things I was going to bring up. Verse 10, the king knows that Mordecai is a Jew. So, it would seem kind of weird that, a few days before he signs an order to wipe out the Jews, and then, just a few days later, he's now rewarding a Jew who he has intended to have killed. That may point to the fact that he didn't know what was going on with this order of payments. Does anybody have any comments on that? Any other comments on chapter 6? Yeah.
Just going to reiterate something I've said several times already, but in Haman's case, you're really seeing the effects of selfishness and being driven by ego and pride in this situation where his family and all his closest counsel is saying, you're on your own, man. Like, we don't want to be a part of this. You're done for. If you live your life striving for worldly things before anything else, you're going to be surrounded with other people like that just naturally to reinforce what you believe is most important. But in the end, you'll have nothing. You won't even have the people that are supposed to be closest to you, your family, your wife, your husband, whoever. So that's a pretty striking lesson, I think, to take from that.
I think that's a great point. Maybe even the chief lesson from that chapter, man with his power and influence, a lot of times end up being surrounded by sycophants and yes men, and they're not there because you're such a great guy. They're there for all the worldly reasons that go along with being in a position of power like that. Good point. Anyone else? All right, well, we're going to go on and we're going to get into chapter 7 here. I'm going to go ahead and read the first 6 verses for us. So the king and Haman went into the feast with Queen Esther. And on the second day, as they were drinking wine after the feast, the king again said to Esther, "What is your wish, Queen Esther? It shall be granted to you. And what is your request? Even to the half of my kingdom it shall be fulfilled." Then Queen Esther answered, "If I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be granted me for my wish and my people for my request. For we have been sold, and I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. If we had been sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have been silent, for our affliction is not to be compared with the loss to the king." Then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther, "Who is he, and where is he, who has dared to do this?" And Esther said, "A foe and enemy, this wicked Haman." Then Haman was terrified before the king and the queen. All right, well, here it is. The truth comes out. Second banquet. King has to be dying to know what Esther's request is, and repeats that promise up to half the kingdom. We already talked about that in the previous class, but obviously he's willing to go pretty far for her. And she finally makes a request. In the Hebrew, it's only 4 words, and I'm not even going to try to pronounce them, but they translate to what we see here: my life at my petition, and my people at my request. And this is actually I think this has become sort of a prayer for the Jews, recited on special occasions, fast days, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, all of those. And so that's one popular verse with Jews, even to this day. You'll hear it at all those events. What's some interesting What's something interesting that y'all find about these few verses? Go ahead.
Well, he really didn't seem shocked that when Esther said she was one of the people, when she was a Jew. I mean, we questioned throughout the class as to whether or not he really knew she was a Jew or not. And at least to this point, he didn't say, "Oh, so you're a Jew," or whatever. So that didn't seem to take him by surprise. Second thing is, I'm prone to believe by this that when he signed that decree to begin with, he didn't know what he's doing, because when she says it's Haman, then that's the surprise to him. So he was probably just like a lot of kings are, and a lot of rulers are, just sitting there rubber stamping stuff as it's going by him, and really doesn't even realize what he's signing.
I think that's right. I think this further points to the idea that he heard a big dollar sign, and he just kind of sent it on through. His second in command, he trusts the guy. Do what you want. Sure.
So at least the ESV doesn't call out that she says she's a Jew. But the interesting thing to me too is Mordecai is not mentioned at all. So that could have been the card that was played, that maybe Mordecai was set up, or this kind of the backstory behind this vendetta, if you will. But she keeps it simple and says, myself and my people are about to be annihilated. It'd be better if we were slaves. I did have a question, though. I wonder what she means in verse 4. So if we had been sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have been silent, for our affliction is not to be compared with the loss to the king. What do you think that means? Just from a losing people to work in the king, you know what I mean? Like from a
what do y'all think?
perspective,
What's the group's idea here? Go ahead, Ian.
I mean, this is referring to the thing that Haman enacted, right? They're setting out to kill all of them and take all their money for profit and give it to the king. So it'd be better to be slaves than to be annihilated and have everything taken, right? That's
Jordan's question, though. The king thinks he's getting something, and she's saying, you're about to lose something. That's herself. She's going to have to die.
That's going to be part of it. I think it means that the Jews were worth more to the Persians alive than dead, and the king didn't see that. Certainly worth more than the 10,000 talents that Haman would give. I think she probably means maybe financially over the long term, or maybe from just like an immediate economic and administrative perspective. Like you take out millions of people out of your empire and they're gone. There's jobs that are now not getting done. Taxes aren't coming in from those people. It may not immediately compare to the 10,000 talents of silver, but on down the road, it's a net loss. Go ahead, Ian.
what's it going to do to all of Persia when everybody finds out that the king is committing genocide? I mean, I would think if I wasn't a Jew, am I next? So there's a lot of potential destruction that could come from this one decision, not to mention the financial loss. So I think she's maybe thinking of the whole scope of things.
Civil implications could be huge, not just for the Jews, but for the rest of the empire, for sure. Robert.
I think she's crafty. I think there are a couple of different meanings here. And I think that while everything that was said is true, she's playing to him, and you're about to lose your queen, the one you just got. Do you really want to do that?
Yeah, that could very well be it too. Just knowing Ahasuerus as she does, it just could be another tactic, couldn't it? Any other thoughts? Yeah, Michael.
I noticed in the first few verses that this all happened on the second day. So she was waiting, and maybe just waiting till he, I don't know, people had been saying that maybe she set up the whole thing so he would get drunk and not have a good, just, I don't know, maybe judgment or be more ready to hear, I don't know. Anyway, I think an interesting detail.
They do mention it, it does mention in chapter 2, and on the second day, as they were drinking wine after the feast, I mean, he was probably, as usual, it looks like, intoxicated, so it could be a moment where she's chosen the right time for this. Any other thoughts? Yeah.
I think she also was smart that she did not mention Haman's name until the king specifically asked the information.
I agree. Yeah, that's a pretty clever tactic. Get him worked up, and then present him with the name and the evidence. Maybe some lessons there to learn about how to get what you want. So Xerxes immediately asks, "Who is he?" Do you think he doesn't know what she's talking about at that point? Before she says it's Haman, do you think he's still oblivious to? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think so. I think she builds this up, like you said, says it's Haman, and avoids placing any responsibility on the king. She's probably more interested in saving her people than pointing the finger at him also. That would probably be counterproductive for a guy like Xerxes, as we know, and allows him to focus his full wrath on Haman. Haman, rightfully afraid. The tables have, it just keeps getting worse for this guy. He's, within a matter of days, the tables have completely turned on him. So, any thoughts, any more thoughts on those first 6 verses? John?
Well, just to add to her craftiness, she did not start the conversation. She waited till she was asked. So on top of all the other good comments about her ways of manipulating the situation.
Yeah.
She
Shows some real wisdom and craftiness there, for sure. All right, let's go on, and we'll go ahead and read 7 through 10 here. And the king arose in his wrath from the wine drinking and went into the palace garden. But Haman stayed to beg for his life from Queen Esther, for he saw that harm was determined against him by the king. And the king returned from the palace garden to the place where they were drinking wine, as Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was. And the king said, "Will he even assault the queen in my presence, in my own house?" As the word left the mouth of the king, they covered Haman's face. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs in attendance on the king, said, "Moreover, the gallows that Haman has prepared for Mordecai, whose word saved the king, is standing at Haman's house, 50 cubits high." And the king said, "Hang him on that." So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the wrath of the king was abated. The end of that guy. He's had a rough few days. It's kind of a hard way to go. So yeah, king finally realizes he's been duped by Haman, and he's condemned the queen herself to death. Who knows how long they've been at the wine at this point. He's probably a little intoxicated, angry, trying to come to terms with the fact that he's been betrayed by his second in command. And no doubt he's aware that what he's done can't be reversed, right? Remember the law of the Medes and the Persians? There's no reversal. Haman stands up, asks the queen to spare his life. It's pretty obvious where this is headed. He's not going to make it out of here. The Hebrew word for what Haman does is it's bakesh, and it's not as intense as like the word beg, but it's getting close to being begging. It's like official request, I guess is the best way to describe it. And he sees that she's unmoved, and what does he do? Does he attack her, or what happens here? Right. Yeah, this is like the ultimate, save me, spare my life. I don't think it's that he's actually attacking the queen.
I don't either. I don't know if it was distraught or, again, if it was the wine playing games with him and he fell down on the couch, stumbled, whatever it might be. So I think there's room for interpretation as to why he fell on the couch.
Yeah. It doesn't appear that he was actually doing any kind of physical harm to her, but the intensity of that situation, realizing that you're finished. Ian?
I don't know if this is, in John's words, providence or God's provinces. But you see Haman, this whole situation was started for Mordecai's unwillingness to bow down before him. And now he's having to bow down before a Jew to ask for mercy. So it ends where it all started, except with him having to bow down and, surrender all of his power. Just think that's very ironic.
Yeah, it's a kind of a poetic way to...
He did have at least clearness of mind to stay and talk to Esther, not follow the king out. So he at least recognized that if there was any hope at all, it's going to come from her, not the king.
Yeah, interesting that he didn't beg for the king. He went to her. I think he probably knew the gig was up at this point, and this was the last ditch effort to try and survive. Throws himself on the couch, the last in a series of big mistakes by Haman, and right at that moment, king comes in, sees him on the couch, and does what? They end up covering his head. Does he misinterpret what he's seeing? Does he think that Haman's assaulting the queen, or is there more to it than that? It kind of seems that way. It could also be that he sees an opportunity here to rid himself of this guy easily. A guy throwing himself down, begging for his life. It could be that he could say, oh, he's attacking the queen, let's get rid of this guy. That's how some people have interpreted it anyway. Maybe it was just a misunderstanding. Maybe he actually did think that he was attacking the queen. Some people seem to think that he just used it to his advantage to have Haman done away with. Immediately executed. Yeah.
Probably do anything he wanted to do. He was a god.
Right. He can't reverse the law of the Medes and the Persians, so yeah, but up to that point, he probably could. Any other thoughts? Yeah, Robert?
I'm just struck, and again, I don't know I know the absolute power part, but I'm struck by what we don't see. We don't see a dialogue, a trial, a back and forth, denials. We don't see any of that. We just see Esther says, this is how it is, and Haman says, I'm about to die. There's no other in between. And I would have thought that as number two in the kingdom, you'd have Ahasuerus say, hey, what is this that Esther's saying about you? Could that possibly be? Have a little bit of dialogue? I don't see any.
We don't have any from the story, that's for sure. It seems like this all happens pretty quick. And that's interesting. I guess that shows that the king was the law, basically, and what he said went. Trials and that sort of thing were not a... Yeah.
Just
Hollywood has done a great job of now taking this story and building upon that sniveling second in command person that is begging for life. So I grew up with a lot of movies and not books, or I chose not to get into the books, but I just can visually see this person, this Haman, just begging and tripping over himself and just pleading and crying and losing all character and all. So I can really see the vision. I don't know if we're going to move on, but the eunuch speaking up, I just can't help but think Esther had good rapport with the staff and the personnel, that this eunuch was willing to speak up and throw fire or throw more wood under the fire, going, and guess what? He's also built gallows. So and that's to help the situation. I don't know the eunuch is going to gain anything by this, but either sympathy, empathy for Esther, and this eunuch throws this out there, and it just takes it to a whole nother level.
Yeah. We know in some of the previous chapters from her interactions with her servants and the eunuchs that she was winning favor wherever she was. And that's interesting that a eunuch, a servant, would step in and say, and, he's built this gallows for Mordecai. That's an interesting part of the story here. The eunuchs take this as a sign, like you said, to speak up, and they cover the man's condemned man's face. According to some Roman and Greek historians, this was actually a customary practice. He would place a hood over the condemned man's face because he was no longer worthy to see the light. It makes sense. It's thought that the Greeks and the Romans actually copied this practice. They got it from the Persians. So, kind of an interesting note there. We talked about Harbona speaking up. He's one of the king's 7 chamberlains. Have we seen him before in this book? Chapter 1. He was one of the guys that was ordered to bring Vashti before the king to the party, and he's obviously very well informed of Haman's plot to have Mordecai executed because he knows about the gallows. It's an interesting thing. This guy's in the palace waiting on the king, but he knows what's going on over at Haman's place. So maybe give us some indication of the amount of talk and stuff throughout the palace. This Haman's plot was pretty well known. Why he was doing it must have been fairly well known too. So
Albert made the good point about maybe the respect for Esther, but I think maybe you're making this point too. But very clearly, they did not like Haman either.
Yes.
So, however Haman was behaving with Mordecai must have been very it wasn't about Mordecai being a Jew. This was probably his behavior towards everybody, including the king's council.
Mm-hmm.
You could see him barking at them when the king walks out, and they all roll in their eyes at what they have to do for him.
That could be a big part of it too. Yeah. He may not have been a very well-loved figure. You would think not. The way he demonstrates his pettiness and all that, you'd think that Mordecai probably wasn't the only object of his ire, just maybe the biggest one. Did somebody raise their hand over here? No. Okay. We spoke about him building the gallows in his courtyard. We spoke about what that was, right? Is this a thing where he's going to be hanged from the neck till dead, or is this something else? Yeah. Well, it just doesn't sound like a pleasant way to go. You get run through with a spike and then hoisted up in the air 50 cubits high. I don't know that it said that it was going to be in his courtyard previously, but we find out here that this guy is so barbarous that he's going to have a man executed and then have his body hung in his own home to look at his pleasure. So if you needed any more evidence that Haman was just a horrible person, there it is. What happens? The king immediately has Haman face the very fate that he had planned for Mordecai. And it says the king's anger was pacified. Okay, any thoughts on these last few verses? Haman's comeuppance. Yeah.
So I'm going to read verse 10, and then I'm going to go back to chapter 2.
Okay.
So they hanged Haman on the gallows and prepared that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the wrath of the king abated. Do we know what that means? He's dead, right? So in chapter 1, we read about Vashti being put out, but chapter 2, verse 1 says, and when after these things, when the anger of the king had abated. So I think we kind of talked about this before. Was that just like, oh, he got over it? But the vocabulary here is so particular. I think you can use the verse in chapter 7 to conclude that the king actually had Vashti killed. Maybe just a throwback side comment. But
That's an interesting thought. I hadn't thought about that myself, but maybe the only way to appease the king's wrath is to have people killed. I mean, it makes sense because he was a bit of a lunatic himself. So I think Vashti probably was executed at some point, whether it was right after that party or at some point in the future. Albert.
I didn't hear John's definition. It abated?
Abated?
Okay. All right. But I have a reference in here that it's a verb, to subside, decrease, to abate, to allay.
Mm-hmm.
So he was pacified.
Right.
Is another way. So I heard something about death,
we had seen that very same statement before in chapter 2 when the king's wrath was abated after the whole situation with Vashti. We were maybe thinking that it could possibly mean that Vashti was also executed like Haman was. Right, that he was. Right. Any other comments? Jordan.
Maybe one of the one like John. It's interesting that now Mordecai's name is brought up, but it's not brought up by Esther specifically. It's brought up by the eunuch. So again, maybe speaking to the craftiness of Esther, I guess you would assume, hey, king, let me tell you this elaborate plot and why it happened. My uncle or my cousin, uncle, dad, Mordecai, and all this kind of stuff. But she keeps it short and sweet, simple. And then when Mordecai is finally brought up, it's actually the eunuch that says he did this to hang on Mordecai. Remember, who saved the king in the first place. So interesting kind of turn of events, I guess, if you will.
Yeah. Perhaps some providence. There was some providence. He's just had Mordecai rewarded. It's on his mind. He knows the players involved, and maybe that's how the eunuchs kind of knew what was up to. Any other thoughts on some of these things? Some lessons maybe we can take from this that we haven't already discussed, or some that we have if you want to go back over them. Yeah, Albert.
Just from this class, my responsibility to process and vet information given to me. I mean, I have, like at work, I have a responsibility to give reports to customers of testing when we test product. They come to me, we've had, unfortunately, product go back out to the customer and then leak. When we said it was good, I went off of what my managers told me, and then when I go out, I see that they had a flawed testing process or so. I have a responsibility, like Azra should have had, to find out what people are you talking about and what is the implication. So it's just a modern day application for me to take in, and I'm accountable for what still my actions. whether I've got good data or bad data, I'm still responsible for my actions. So
That's-
I need to be more on alert.
That's an excellent point. I think that's listening leadership we can learn from this. Check, make sure you know what something's going on before you send it on. Jordan.
I think also, to me anyway, our words matter. What we say actually matters. So, think that kids thing, right? Sticks and stones might break my bones, but words never hurt. That's not true at all. Nothing can be more false. So the things we say and the way in which we say them have direct impacts both in a positive and a negative sense. And obviously in Esther's it was a positive sense. Haman, in haste, it was very much in a negative sense. And so that's a warning to me anyway.
Very good. Yeah. Warning for us all, for sure. Any other thoughts on that?
But you had made a comment when we were talking about if the king had misinterpreted Haman falling down, or maybe he used it as a convenient excuse, that sort of thing by some people. I have a tough time personally thinking he had such a lucid moment at that moment that he thought, I'll use this to get him with. We've seen throughout here that when he gets liquored up, he makes bad decisions and rash decisions. Obviously, he was liquored up in this particular instance. And so I personally, I'm not saying they're wrong, but personally, I think he just misinterpreted the situation and made a rash decision about, let's kill him, let's go, as opposed to really thinking, oh, well, this would be a good excuse to do that. That'd almost be the first time that he's used a lucid moment to make a decision.
Prevailing thought is he did misinterpret what was seen. Just some writers and scholars seem to think that for the first time in what appears to be his entire life, that he has a moment of clarity and craftiness. But the prevailing thought is that he actually thought Haman was attacking the queen. So, good point. Yeah, Ian.
You got to consider what he's going through when he finds this out, right? Because he didn't know what Haman was up to. He's going back to all the way to the very beginning of his relationship with Haman and thinking about all the things that Haman has done that he's potentially pulled over the king's eyes and gotten away with. So he's beating himself up about this. He's been drinking. I think, he may not have known, but I think he also had a sense of what he was doing. Like, he had already made up his mind, I think, in the garden what he was going to do. He just needed a trigger to say the words. And that so happened to be that he fell down on the couch. It could have been anything.
Could have been. Yeah. Haman's fate was probably. He was going to die. It was.
And I would think that it would be maybe not similar to someone approaching the king, but there's certainly a place that you wouldn't want to be with the queen. You wouldn't want to sit down on the couch with her.
Right.
I would think that would be an absolute. There, and even if he hadn't been caught up in this scheme to kill all the Jews, that he was just in a place he shouldn't be.
Most likely, he violated a number of protocols and stuff when it came to interacting with the queen. Whether those would have been, I guess they could have been punishable by death. A lot of things seem to have been punishable by death in that empire. But he made a series of big mistakes. Finally, with this one being his last. Anyway, those were good points. I'm pretty much at the end of what we got here, unless y'all have some more thoughts or ideas. Yeah, Ian.
Sorry, I got one more thought. And it's really just more so about the Jewish people during this time.
Mm-hmm.
That the fact that Mordecai is a Jew. He's telling Esther, when you're in the king's house, don't disclose this. So that leads you to believe that either the Jews at this time are held in a negative light, or maybe there's a plan that he wants to set in motion down the road that we're not aware of. But I think that when we talk about the situation with Haman and his family, when he's coming back and they're like, hey, you're pretty much done for. I think that they could could have reflected back on the tales of the Jewish people and their resiliency and their ability to pull through in kind of crazy circumstances and still be around. So I think they're thinking, like, if a Jew has the favor of the king, that's pretty much written in stone that, you're done for. So I just think that's interesting. In this chapter, we see so much essence of what could be interpreted as God's providence here, kind of all culminating
It all
together.
comes together in this one. Yeah. Very good. Thank you. Does anybody else have any final comments or thoughts on this chapter, or any of the rest of the book, last week's class? All right. Well, we're going to kind of hang it up here early, and we will resume on Sunday with chapter 8. Thank you all for your comments.